I'm Managing Director for Policy and founder of the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. And we're going to continue the conversations that we've been having this morning with a fresh set of panelists here who bring a lot of very valuable expertise to the discussion. Linda Bailey is the Executive Director of the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, which is really, I think I was in a meeting earlier this morning here where there was NACTO's annual meeting was hailed as one that had a lot of energy going on, where in contrast to a meeting of public transport officials that also happened recently, where the energy wasn't quite as high in the mature industry, city transportation officials right now are rocking. And I think this comes out of the leadership of people like Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, the former New York City DOT commissioner who's now chairing the board of NACTO and who Linda had worked for as a federal advisor and is now leading NACTO in that. We're going to also hear from Gitam Tiwari, and Gitam is the head of the Transport Research and Injury Prevention Program in Delhi, really one of the foremost researchers on sustainable transport and traffic safety, focusing particularly on these challenges in the developing world. Elliot Sklar, Center for Sustainable Urban Development at Columbia University, one of the people I've looked up to as I was a very young graduate student and undergraduate student, considering what to do with my career. And Michael Myers, who we heard in the last panel from the Rockefeller Foundation. So we want to really talk here about access and ways. There are lots of ways to create better access in cities through changes in design, street space allocation, pricing, proximity of uses, provision of mobility services, better operations, and a variety of other things. And we know that improved access is a key to more sustainable transportation, supporting sustainable development goals. I'd like to turn to Linda first and ask, based on your experience in New York and with NACTO, what are the 2 or 3 things that that city leaders should focus on most to help us over the next 5 years improve access and advance sustainable development? How can these things best be advanced? Who are the most important actors who need to be engaged in partnerships that win? What's your theory of victory in this?
Great, thanks, Michael. I just want to say first, I'm really happy to be here. I have a background in research, so it's fun to be talking to more researchers and also in policy. And I think that the great thing about working with practitioners, as I do in my membership, the cities that are members of NACTO, is that they have to live within the bounds of today while keeping an eye on the distant future. As we know, big transportation projects like Second Avenue Subway is going to be a centennial project, I think, in the end. And the people in New York laughing because they're like, when will it ever finish? But I think we're looking at stuff that can be done sooner, and we're also looking at things that can help us to actually grow. Cities in the U.S. in particular weren't growing for a long time, and now that we're looking at growth, we're saying like, okay, here I am in New York. It's a big city. It's going to add 1 million people. Is that 1 million more cars? Like, is that going to work? Like, that seems like that absolutely can't work, right? It's just mind-boggling. It's already crazy. It's already high traffic. And the same goes for all the big cities in the US, and those are our core members. And so they're really saying like, okay, if we're going to succeed, we really need to do stuff that takes advantage of other modes, whether it's walking to a local grocery. Cycling is a very underused mode in some city, although some cities in our network have already 10% mode share for biking, like Oakland in California. And then transit is another big thing. And so I think people are really looking, okay, what can we do short term to fix transit? BRT. BRT was already mentioned, is very important, and just in general, improving bus service. From my perspective, my members are the road and bridge agencies in general, with a couple of exceptions. And what we're talking about is how do we restructure our roads and bridges to make transit actually work even better. rather than the other way around. I think historically, people design the roads and bridges for a bunch of private vehicles, maybe some trucks, and then later they're like, oh, there's a bus stop there. I guess I'll, like put a sign over there, okay. So we're actually trying to be more proactive and really make it work. And the same thing on cycling. It's actually a lot of really cheap infrastructure for the most part to enhance cycling infrastructure because people are riding in the right of way, and it's really just about creating a safe place and more inviting place to cycle. And then again for walking, which is also essential to transit. You can never forget that transit riders need to walk usually to their destination on either end of their trip on transit. So those are the things that people are really looking at, and I think protected bike lanes, better bus provisions for surface transit, bus or light rail, frankly, or streetcars, and kind of thinking about how to do those things in the short term so that it makes a win for the mayor, who is the boss of the people in my network, who needs to get reelected usually within a 4-year span. So that's always really critical, thinking about things we can do now that people can kind of see on the ground.
Great. Geetam, I'll turn to you next. How do these challenges, what vary in developing countries like India? A lot of the same issues, but different governance frameworks and capacity. What do you think are the strategies where the biggest payoff is? Who needs to be engaged? How can we move forward and get some short-term success over the next 5 years?
I think in emerging economies like India and many of the other Asian countries, there are similar issues, not exactly the same issues. And one of the major differences is that we have urban areas which are heterogeneous mix. It is not a homogeneous. Of course, all cities have heterogeneity, but it's the amount of heterogeneity that exists in those cities is much higher. And that poses some very different challenges because it is not just that varied socioeconomic groups which inhabit the same space. They don't have only different needs, but often conflicting needs. And then you need to make some hard decisions. And I think especially when we talk about access and sustainable development, it really means that we are looking at how do you provide access and how do you meet the needs of the most vulnerable groups who are the silent majorities. And that is where you have a major challenge. So access and sustainable development is really about creating urban spaces which are inclusive, and by inclusivity means meeting these conflicting needs and needs of the vulnerable group. It can be, of course, it has to be done at 3 levels: the planning level, land use planning level, urban design level, and street level. And at all 3 levels, we have major challenges. Because at planning level, it means really addressing the question of the very strong link between livelihood, access, and mobility, which in some senses means we have to address the issue of informality and formality. As professionals and as trained planners, we know how to make formal plans and for formal sector. But I think we have still very little understanding about informal sector. Second, then at the urban design level, we are looking at, many of these cities are already high density cities. They already have mixed land use patterns. What is really required is to improve quality of life given these 2 things which already exist. And that quality of life improvement basically means not just transport. It is about providing basic urban amenities and urban services within at the same location. And that becomes challenging because that is against your land markets. I think at street level, in some senses, the solution seems very simple, in quote unquote. Of course, we have to design streets for pedestrians, bicyclists, and public transport users in that order. But the question is, why doesn't this happen? If you look at, by any definition, by resource constraint, by accessibility, safety, it is a win-win situation. Why doesn't it happen? To my mind, I think there are 2 major threats. And the threats really come from because there is commercial interest in land, there is commercial interest in technology which is being given, and there is commercial interest in construction. Earlier we had this whole, some discussion on infrastructure construction. So there is transport solution and transport infrastructure construction, sometimes the boundary seems to be blurring. And this is what poses major threat. And of course, I think these city leaders and people who are interested in sustainable and accessibility issues, they have to watch out for commercial interest of national as well as a lot of international players. These national and international both players come in the as advisors, as consultants, as technology sellers. And I think given the financial power of some of the industry, it is a major threat. It is, we heard earlier, foundations are playing a very useful and extremely important role. But is that enough to really, the financial power that comes with the major industries, both in our technology, the vehicular technology, and also construction technology industry. So I would say I think the action required are at two stages. Of course, in short term, I would say especially for emerging economies, instead of starting with the planning level, we could immediately start with the street level. And street level is, in some senses, basically return streets to people. And what does it mean? It is a major challenge because then you are challenging one of the most powerful industries. And but I think there is no other solution other than really actually returning streets to people. I think at urban design level, we have a lot of discussion on transit-oriented development. But I think as far as emerging economies are concerned, we should be looking at, as I say, instead of TOD, we should be looking at POD and BOD, which is basically pedestrian-oriented development and bicycle-oriented development. Because sometimes transit-oriented development just ends up becoming a land market issue. We just want to capture value of land and fund high technologies which are capital intensive. Not to say that TOD is not important, definitely it's important, but I think we have to have our priorities right here. And I think in the long term, there are a lot of issues that we have to really resolve, looking in terms of institutional mechanisms, innovative financing scheme. As it was mentioned earlier, that many of these sustainable mobility and access issues do not have any market value. They are not fundable projects. The finances are available for capital intensive project, but you say you want to prepare a really nice bicycle, pedestrian friendly street, no bank is willing to fund you. So I think we have to come up with some innovative mechanisms of making that possible, and a lot of mechanisms and efforts in making and enabling the silent majority, vocal majority, which is really tough.
Great. Thank you very much. I think very, very thoughtful. Michael, the philanthropy, as you said in the last session, has a key role here as a risk taker to engage in strategies that maybe the markets aren't ready to deal with because the risks are too high and that governments are too timid to address for political challenges. How do you see the network of people in this room working most effectively with philanthropy to come up with those kinds of risky but high leverage strategies that can make a difference in this space around developing access and equity?
I want to build on something that Geetam just said that was very important about the multiple levels at which this takes place and the emphasis on the street level as not only the ground truth of what's going on and what people need, but the political power that comes from that aspect of it. I think philanthropy interacting with people in this room and beyond, we need to keep in mind that with transportation, it's a means, not an end in of itself. So more and more we're realizing that transportation is a way to connect people to opportunity. We're realizing that there's an environmental aspect to it too, as the world becomes seized more and more with climate change and other challenges. We realize that transportation is a means toward, I was talking earlier about resilience, so that in New York with Superstorm Sandy, subways were down, buses were one of the few ways of getting around. So doing this properly is a resilience play. So there are multiple benefits of transportation, is my point. It's not just getting people from one place to another. And if we realize that, then we realize that, oh, there are multiple stakeholders in this question as well. It can get messy dealing with multiple stakeholders, we all know that, but there's a power that comes from it when it's not just us who are thinking about the important technical aspects of transportation, but it's people who begin to see transportation as a means to better health, as a means to a better livelihood, and so forth. So there are broader coalitions, I think, that are available beyond what we normally think of that. I remember a conversation with a mayor here in the United States not long ago, and she was newly elected to her position and felt a lot of pressure to build new schools. That was the big challenge in her community. And so she was cutting all kinds of corners in the environmental reviews and all that to get those schools built. And when I talked to her about, well, what about the schools as a community hub? What about the economic advantages of schools? Did you take time to think about that? No, I didn't have time for that. You know, I had a political problem I had to deal with right away. But if we are thinking more broadly about the benefits of transportation, sure, it may take us a little bit longer to get a project done because we're consulting so many other people. But I think we come out, one, with a stronger product in the end, but number two, a political coalition that can help deal with some of the vested interest that Gitan was referring to earlier.
Great, thank you. Elliot, you wrote a book back in 1975 called Access for All, which I know when I read it in my sophomore year of University of Pennsylvania, I said, that's a place where I could do some work. And it probably was that and Jane Jacobs were the two books that brought me into the space that I've worked for the rest of my life. What have we learned in the 35 years since then about we've seen a lot of rapid motorization, a lot of sprawl. There's certain things that we envisioned back then that maybe are foreclosed, but there are new opportunities that have opened. And you know, what are the key threats and key opportunities that you see right now? What should we be doing to move forward?
Well, personally, I haven't learned anything. Let me explain. I wrote that. I was the junior author, and he was my mentor, K.H. Schaefer. Nick Schaefer always taught me. He said, "A city is a solution to a transportation problem, and the best solution to a transportation problem is not to have to travel at all." Right. And essentially, so where Access for All came about is we were realizing that what had happened is, while mobility was a way to get access, mobility had become an end in itself, and that what the city was about, access, was getting lost. And to the extent that I say I've learned nothing at all, I still think that's the issue. The difference now is the word access is used a lot more. When we were first using the word, I think we would tolerate it. The key issue that I think we have is a governance issue. I'm listening to Gitan and listening to Michael and Linda. I think and especially when you talked about when the notion of giving people good service, it became a real issue. I began to think there's the old Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Senator Moynihan, who was a strong advocate for the senator from New York, a strong advocate for transit and public transportation. When he died, he gets up to heaven and God says, well, you've done good work, you're a good public servant, you can ask me one question. And he says, well, God, I have one question. And the question was, will they ever finish the 2nd Avenue subway? And God looked at him and said, yes, Pat, but not in my lifetime. And that issue of governance has become more imperative, because when that book was written, we had a lot of assumptions about the Keynesian state, and that governments would solve macroeconomic problems, governments would provide services. Fast forward, when I was asked to head up the task force for the Millennium Development Goals on slums, the word was government doesn't work, only markets work. And that what we want to do is incentivize markets. But what became very clear in the travels around the world when we're doing this, markets only work when government works, when governance works. And so the question, the real question became, how does one do this? I just read, somebody wrote a piece, and I can't remember where I read it. You read all these things on the web, they look the same. But it was about what happened in Afghanistan. When the Taliban came back, what happened to people first? They were very relieved because they were getting services again. The other issues, what? Well, you didn't miss anything. Okay, Dinesh, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's working now, I think.
All right, is this better?
Yeah.
All right, let me put it up here. Well, the point is, what people expect governments to provide service, and so when we talk about using the market, we have to start from the assumption that markets are good servants but terrible masters, and ultimately, so as we begin to we talk about more private investment. One of the problems that's been happening with what we call P3s in this country, private finance initiatives in the UK, is a lot of them have boiled down to financial engineering and the notion that you can govern by contract. I am a technological mess. Anyway, you somehow have to, that you can govern by contracts, and that and the problem becomes they become complexly financially engineered. The Indiana toll road just went belly up, which was supposed to be the premier example. But what they were doing, they were using these fancy devices called essentially accretion financing, where they paid low debt at first, and then they paid more later. So they started out with $3.4 billion of debt. Right now, they went bankrupt at $6 billion of debt. And unless you have government that in fact can deliver services, it doesn't matter whether it's publicly provided or it's privately provided under public supervision. You need to have governance. And I think the issue that I would stress that we need to, the two issues that I would want to talk about here are: one, we want to focus on access. Two, mobility is a way to get access. Three, mobility can be financed in only one of three ways: users pay, beneficiaries pay, or everyone pays. And the question becomes, how do we essentially mix the three? Of course, in an era when you have no growth, and if government goes into debt, you could actually have a point where no one pays, where the stimulus you get to the economy helps to finance it. But stick to the first three. What we really need to talk about is how do we balance the three? In other words, how much should users pay? How do you deal with the fact that in a place like the New York region, you have local governments setting parking rates at commuter railroad stations. You have two different commuter rail systems charging different amounts. You've then got city parking. You've got a subway system, and you essentially have city streets that are run by the city of New York. You have bridges and tunnels that are run by another entity of government. And then you have a bi-state government that runs some of the other bridges and the airports. And with the govern New Jersey, it's sometimes erratic whether these things run. So the issue for me is, and the issue I would like us to focus on, are these issues of governance, and the governance has to be about maximizing access. Access is a public good. Private markets underproduce public goods. So how do we balance users, beneficiaries, and what should be paid for publicly?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
I think Elliot has hit on something really important about governance, and I really applaud that, because we've seen so many situations in which there are multiple jurisdictions with competing interests. The rules of the game are not clear, so governance is key. But also what you mentioned about resources, it's governance plus the resources to get things done, I think is terribly, terribly important. I'd be remiss, Michael, if I did not mention that the field is wide open to innovative ideas that can produce the results, deliver the services we need, but at lower cost. So bus rapid transit, I've been very happy that that's been mentioned a number of times, and that's something that I know ITDB, DP, and Rockefeller Foundation have invested in very heavily. So in this meeting, ideas such as that if we can get the governance right, well, how do we afford it, would be interesting.
Can I jump
Yes,
in on that?
sure.
I think the one thing I'll say is, like, the way we think about it within the cities is in the U.S., and I'm a national organization, so I'll just focus on that, but I think a lot of places are investing a lot of money in transportation already. And part of what we want to see is, like, how do you leverage that to get better results? Because, you know, sometimes you see a gleaming brand new street with a bus line running down it, and then there's like a dirt path on the side where the people walk to the bus stop in the U.S., and that's just insane.
Yeah.
There's no reason for that, and the only reason is because of weird jurisdictional ideas. You know, the state thinks that's not my problem, the city doesn't have the money or whatever. But let's just say, like, we're already spending around $200 billion a year on roads and bridges in the United States, and even more, a little bit more on transit. But the $200 billion that's going to roads and bridges is not achieving all the goals we have for those right now, and it could easily. And a lot of that's under the control of states, which is why we work closely with states. But $50 billion of that is still controlled by local entities. That's $50 billion a year, and we can just by leveraging a portion of that, we can do a lot more. We can do a lot better.
Good. Yeah.
I'd like to bring another issue, I think more fundamental issue, because building broad coalitions is important. Of course, governance is important. Yet in 25 years of my professional life, I have not been to any conference of transport where no matter which country or which city people talk about, number one issue they have always been raising is multiplicity of authorities. Multiplicity of authorities controlling transport. Whether we talk about the successful places, Stockholm, or I don't know, maybe from Delhi perspective, New York is better. Because we keep hearing about all the interesting, innovative pedestrianization experiments which have been done here lately. But again, here also we hear about multiplicity of authority. And of course, within India, one of the number one discussion point always comes up with transport issues is, oh, every city is governed by 15 different authorities and they can't get together and they can't have their act together. But I think the more fundamental level that I want to raise some questions is that we keep talking about BRT, and today we heard from Secretary of State also talking about BRT and giving priority, but I actually heard one sentence that he said while talking about BRT. He said, yes, we must build BRT wherever possible. I think the moment you use this word, your priority is clear. Wherever possible means it is not possible most of the places. You are not saying build BRT where it is needed. And it is needed where there are a lot of cars. And you will have to actually confront cars. You will have to take away space from cars, and cars will be inconvenient. Are we ready for that? So in theory, we can say a lot of things. We want sustainable development. We want sustainable mobility. But actually, when you start trying to implement it, despite having broader coalitions, there is no win-win situation. You will have to actually take hard decisions. And I think one of the things that we will have to keep reminding, at least that is my understanding now, the moment we say transport, it is, we are trying to solve congestion problem. By definition, congestion means, we mean car congestion. I have not heard much discussion about where pedestrians are getting stuck in congestion or bicyclists are stuck in congestion. So if it's all about solving car congestion problem, then we will continue to invest despite using different words and terminology. The paradigm change is not taking place.
I think I'd like to now invite some of our discussants who, keep it very short. Yeah. For now.
I'll be brief. Thank
Okay.
you. What I wanted to say was, the other thing on this fragmentation, and one of the things you have to understand is we have institutions that govern transportation that developed out of the way life was lived in the 20th century and 20th century technology. And one of the problems we have is we've got to think, as we rethink the issues of what should be fragmented and what should be consolidated, how do you deal with what 21st century communications and access are going to be about? And the problems are, there's a lag in these institutions. That's one of the things that we, as in the research community, can address. I think Michael raised the point of resources. I think part of what we have to do is make the case for the resources. It's not that the world can't afford these things. It's that they like to do wars for some reason. And I think that if we can begin to change some ideas, that's how we can have an impact. We have a lot of power in the way we put these things. That's all I want.
Great, thank you. I'd like to invite Addie Tomer from Brookings Institution to step to the podium for a moment. We have he and two other discussants who are just going to make very brief remarks and then ask a question of the panel. And you're an expert on metropolitan infrastructure use patterns and infrastructure technology. Could you comment briefly on whether central governments are important to support the rapid scale-up of more sustainable transport and urban development that improves access? And how will technology affect these issues? And do you have a question for the panel?
Yeah, sure. No, I definitely want to get to the question more importantly than what I have to say.
Good.
But to kind of answer what you tossed my way, I think the most important thing, it's not just about central governments either, it's government at all levels, is frankly setting priorities, right? That's one of the most important things that government does, period. It's why for all of us who are in the room who do public policy, that's the whole point, right? It's almost more regulatory than anything else. And in this way, the priorities have obviously been kind of out of whack. I think Elliot's kind of comments really kind of led us there pretty succinctly. And so what we really need to do is set new outcomes, at all levels of government, and they need to be better around both social outcomes as well as broadly speaking economic outcomes. And I think there's no question that, at least, and this is a case where we're in the echo chamber, right, is that it needs to be around accessibility, right? That's pretty clear in this broadly speaking industry for all the different folks who come at it from different angles, whether you're in transport, kind of broadly speaking urban issues, if you're a financier, right, is that it needs to be around the concept of accessibility. And if we do that, if we can set that as our kind of outcome, what it leads us to is a pretty clear problem statement, right, is that we don't have measures to get us to those outcomes, right? The outcomes can help us get there, but that's where we are, is we need to start setting up what are the measures to deliver an accessibility. And to me, this is the key point of where technology enters the conversation, right? Is that we need to better understand how to both collect the data that can help us measure, whatever it is we want to measure on accessibility. And then really important too are the analytical techniques, basically software, right? To deliver on the kind of the possibility that data gives us, right? So if we can both collect better data, if we can then have the analytical tools to understand what it means, then we can actually start to get to these outcomes. And before I toss out the question, I want to really kind of reflect on this per actually Michael's comment about what happened, unfortunately, here with Superstorm Sandy. One of the most interesting things I found, I'd love to say amazing, but it's horrible to use that word relative to a disaster, was seeing how accessibility got ruined due to the subway closures. So there were some excellent techniques that were done by some analytical mapping kind of startups, frankly, to be able to take data that we already had on where people lived, where jobs were, and you could see how accessibility just was ruined, especially once you were outside the city. And in this market, more than most, people tend to think of New York as, often if they don't live here, it's just Manhattan, and they've only visited it. And if you are from here, often you live in the city, and you just think of it as the 5 boroughs. I used to live here, so I know that concept. The metro area is not just almost 20 million, it stretches into Pennsylvania, right? And we actually split it out, but you could really functionally say it goes, and now officially goes to Poughkeepsie too, but you could say it even goes into Connecticut. Access for those folks was absolutely ruined to get to their jobs in Manhattan and even other parts, if let's say they need to go to Long Island or they're Long Island to go to Jersey. And that in itself, the data and the technology helped us better understand what those limitations were. So what I want to kind of toss out to the group, and I think it hits multiple people's comments, is how do we set those new outcomes for government? What are government's role in it, throughout it? And what kind of processes would you recommend for us to make sure we get better technology to start delivering on those new outcomes that we set?
Is there anyone who'd like to take that question? I think we really only have time for sort of one response, and if we can keep it brief. Anyone on the panel care to respond? Elliot.
No, it depends.
Okay.
I think the question is, the question poses, it's the heart of the matter. I don't know, I wouldn't know how to begin to answer it, but it was clear to me that there's a real lag between the institutions by which we govern ourselves and where our technology is right now, and that it's that, we talk about gridlock, we talk about these other things, but I think we're also really talking about the fact that our technology and what we can do is run ahead of the way we govern ourselves. And that's as far as I'm willing to go at this point.
Okay, let me invite Roger Behrens from the African Center of Excellence in Non-Motorized and Public Transport to the stage. And you're an expert on travel surveys and travel behavior, and this really continues on the question we just heard from Addie. How do we, what are the key things that we need to do to get better data, to understand, support, and manage transport services for better access, and how can we use those to get better governance?
Thank you. I'll perhaps address that question first very briefly, and then if I may kind of raise a question, sure, particularly to Jitam. Okay. Well, I think from a data point of view, one of the things that is perhaps shared by many cities in the global south is in effect the absence of reliable and current data. I mean, very often, anybody who's tried to do some kind of comparison of anything simple like a mode share across a whole lot of cities in the global south will find that ultimately you'll be using sources with 1999 as the source very often. So just persuading politicians in the context of really tight financial resources to allocate money to collecting data is a really difficult thing. And we end up with oftentimes situations where we really don't know the big changes that are occurring right under our noses very often. And in my own particular city of Cape Town, I think that's probably true. We don't really know, for instance, what our mode shares are and how they're changing, and you don't get any form of triangulation when you look at alternative sources of information. So my sense of one of the things that we can do is perhaps move to much more continuous forms of data collection, where we don't expect politicians to once every 5 or 10 years suddenly vote millions and millions of dollars to a very expensive survey or data collection exercise, but rather embed in their practices from year to year a process of continuous survey and continuous data collection, which has the benefit perhaps of enabling longitudinal analysis and begin to understand the impact of some of the quite expensive interventions that we're wanting to make. That's the one point I wanted to make. The other has to do with, also I think it's probably fair to say, a common limitation around doing any kind of post-evaluation of the effects of big investments. And we really do need to develop practices in before and after analysis and some kind of way of picking up on some of the points that have been made, understanding who are the real beneficiaries of interventions. If we really do want spatially just transport systems, we need to understand who are the people that are benefiting from these expensive rail operations in, say, Delhi and in Gauteng in South Africa. Who are the people that are benefiting from the BRT systems and so on and so forth. Perhaps then I can move on to a question, if I may, I think directed at GTAM. I think you raised some really interesting points around the heterogeneity of our cities and the fact that it's not easy in the sense that different groups' interest might conflict with others. And I think that the Delhi BRT is a really interesting case study in that. And then I think you made the very interesting point that you know, the silent majority are the ones who very often have a voice missing in our planning processes. And I think the term that you used was to the starting point to producing a plan might be your words were to return the streets to the people, if I understood you correctly. So my question to you is really to ask you to elaborate on that idea of what does that really mean to turn the streets back to the people in terms of producing a plan? How does one move from such an approach to producing a citywide transport plan that begins to talk to a whole lot of the equity issues that you raised?
I think it's a great question. If you could elaborate in about 90 seconds or less, that would be great.
Yeah, returning streets to people is at two levels. One is that when we talk about inclusive streets, it cannot come without inclusive cities. So first is actually looking at the planning issues. Basically, I think fundamentally people move to cities because they want access to livelihood. So basically we have to learn from there, where are they locating, by many times defying formal plans, because so that they can get access to livelihood. Second, so this is what we need to start integrating into our formal plans then. Learning from, I would say, self-organizing systems, because these people are basically defying the formal plans, and that is what in many times we call formation of slums, because by some definition of formal plans, that area is not meant for residential uses. Second point, returning streets to people means, I would give you a very simple example. Of course, we have people walking, bicycling, using public transport, and cars and two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So how should we design our streets? People have to cross the road. You cannot use a public transport without crossing a road. It has to be done safely. Should we make a foot-over bridge or a subway, or should we let people cross at grade? I think if we want to return streets to people, we will have to accept cars must stop and people have to cross at grade. However, if we are still thinking from cars' lenses, then we will like to construct a foot-over bridge and we will say, look, we are providing facilities for pedestrians. It is not meant for pedestrians. It is basically giving message to car users, you can go uninterrupted. This at-grade surface belongs to you. I think this is what it means when you say returning streets to people. Every small geometric standard operational strategies that we are doing, for everything we have two strategies. One, when we start looking at from returning streets to people perspective, and the other is that cars cannot be inconvenienced. It is aspirational. Many people want to have cars, and in future many people will be dependent on motorized transport. So I think for every such issue we have two solutions, and that is where we have to make a clear, we have to prioritize. There is no, as I said earlier, there is no win-win situation.
Great.
90 seconds over.
That's very good. I'd like to invite our final discussant to the microphone. George Makajuma has worked with the African Development Bank and worked on road engineering across Africa. And I want to ask, what role can multilateral institutions play in advancing better local access for all? The 8 largest multilateral development banks in 2012 pledged $175 billion for more sustainable transport over the next decade with annual reporting. What's needed to link actions multilaterally in order to support access for all locally on a global scale? And is there a question you'd like to pose to the panel?
I will also go back to one of the panelists that said that local access is not, has no market, and most of the projects that promote local access are not bankable. However, the multilateral banks have an opportunity to influence good practice, and perhaps for example, some of the areas or means of doing this is to reorient our frameworks for assessing project viabilities. If what I've realized in my areas, limited years of practice, is that there seems to be a disconnect between theoretical frameworks of assessing project viability and practical needs on the ground. If you merely focus on cost-benefit analysis, you realize that issues to do with equity, issues to do with provision of NMT facilities will not get to the table for discussions by policymakers. Because in certain contexts, for example, the accessibility problems are huge and severe, and discussing them with policymakers to prioritize them is not really easy. It presents a lot of difficulties trying to translate accessibility benefits to policymakers and decision makers. So I think we need to be more innovative, and we need to kind of develop mechanisms and means that are context specific. For example, cities in the developing world are miles apart from cities like New York. And if we, the means of measuring accessibility will also have to be different for us to achieve even basic accessibility improvements in cities like the cities in Africa. We have to come up with locally based impact measurements that are locally derived and applied, as opposed to utility-based measures that are mainly developed in the Western world and are dependent on data that may not be available in our context, like Professor Roger mentioned. And so we need to focus on or develop other means of measuring accessibility, like just, for example, trips that can be made in an environment, or opportunities that can be availed by investing in BRT or NMT facilities. So that way, I think we can, we have opportunities to influence the attitudes of the decision makers and perhaps make an improvement. One of the challenges that I also face as a practitioner is how do we finance some of these local or NMT-based accessibility facilities? How do we make them, how do we incentivize the markets to get funds to prioritize them and fund them? That seems to be a main challenge. It's very hard to get a private sector entity coming up to finance this kind of facilities. Yet we know that they present a big opportunity for availing opportunities for the deprived populations in most parts of the world today. So perhaps Professor Elliott could respond to this.
The first thing I was thinking about, you raised the question of how do you measure access? And one of the things that happens to us is we know how to measure mobility. We can measure it by in units of time. We can measure it in volume of travel. We can measure it in cost per mile and cost per minute. But when it comes to access, and one of the things that happens is you can only manage what you can measure. And so there's a kind of a way that we end up always falling back on the mobility. But the question becomes, how does one measure access? I think the example I fond of using now is the banker who lives in Manhattan and walks to work. He's got marvelous access, but his cleaning lady takes 3 buses and 2 trains. If I want to begin to program something around improving access, whose access do I care about, and how do I then value that access? And the access is not just about time. It is also about opportunities to jobs. It's also the one thing I learned doing the work for the UN. We used to measure whether or not you had access to safe drinking water if you lived within a quarter of a mile of a water stand. You had access, but it wasn't true. You could live right next to it, and you didn't have social access. Access is also it's also who's allowed to ride on which vehicles, and the issue that Gitam raised about the question of do you say you got to walk over a bridge because we're not going to inconvenience a car? That's a choice about who has access. So the first thing is that, and then the second question is, once you do that, the issue you raised, George, is how do you begin to prioritize and finance? And what makes that hard is, as you said earlier, the projects that are probably most important are the ones that are least bankable. And yet they're the most important because they create the public goods. And the public good that we want to create is give as many people as possible as much access as possible. And most of those people, they're not bankable. On the other hand, they contribute to the city. If all the people that lived in slums in Nairobi went on strike for a day, the city would shut down. So to me, the question, these are the key questions now. How do you measure access? How do you prioritize it? Access for who? And those are the ones that I think we have to begin to answer if we're going to talk about cities that work for everybody.
Can I jump in? I just want to mention I don't work internationally myself, but here in the U.S., USDOT awards funds similarly in a way to a bank in the sense that through a couple of programs. One is known as Tiger, and it's a competitive grant program, so it has similar questions as you might ask as a development bank, saying like, what's our return? What's the cost-benefit analysis of this project? And Tiger has actually pioneered funding for programs. So instead of like one single project like this bridge or this highway, saying like, we're going to fund 20 different improvements that have been identified in this city. And it might be interesting to look at that as a model for the way to look at it. Because programmatic, when you talk about things that are important for non-motorized transport, which you're mentioning, programmatic is much more important than individual. There's a couple of individual projects, maybe like a pedestrian bridge over a highway that doesn't exist today and it's in an expressway or whatever. But a lot of those other projects that are just like access to every one of the bus stations on this route or something like that, that's a program, and you have to think about it in a little different way. So just a thought.
Yeah, a question I'd like to raise in this regard is I've recently seen a set of really interesting maps produced at the University of Minnesota using census data for 46 or 48 out of the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, showing access, the number of jobs that can be reached from housing within 30 minutes travel time by public transport, walking, or bicycling. And I mean, I think this is a breakthrough that we have this in the United States, and it's possible because we've got better spatial mapping and GIS systems. We have census level block data that's estimated. But how can we use smart data acquisition tools to come up with at least a first generation evaluation of measuring access globally? How can we do this in Africa and Asia and elsewhere where data is harder to get? Are there remote sensing technologies that we can use together with pilot projects, together with the kinds of GIS mapping that Jackie's group at Columbia has done in Kenya and has been done by the World Bank in a handful of cities? Can we replicate that experience and start to get at these issues more effectively? I'll ask that to anyone who wants to take it on.
I'll take a first crack at it. One possibility, and I just throw this out for discussion, is that Rockefeller Foundation on a number of different issues, not just transportation, and work around the world has faced the problem of where do we get the data we need? How do we know we're making progress on something if we don't have the data? And working also fairly extensively in informal communities in different parts of the world. And one sector that's often not tapped for this creative purpose is the so-called civic hacker space. So we have and others have on a number of occasions put out a problem and said, help us solve this data problem. And it's amazing the creativity that gets unleashed in that situation. So that, just to offer that as a possibility.
I'll just say, this is not a NACTO project, but here in New York City, the city has used taxi GPS data to track travel times in more like in real time. Like the DOT receives the data, like I think every day or two from the Taxi and Limousine Commission. And it's leading to a much more up-to-date kind of sense of travel times than if you go out and do specific data collection for a project. And I think the equivalent to that, I'm just thinking like there's GPS on a lot of devices now that people don't think about necessarily. A lot of phones have GPS, and sometimes working with the phone company is a good way to try and understand flows. That's more focused on vehicles. It could be transit or cars. I think one of the new things I'd love to see is if they can start talking about people walking and cycling as well, because you kind of have to be able to pick out who's doing what in a corridor in any case. So maybe that's something they could work on.
That's an interesting, the New York story is interesting because one of the things that happened, because the Taxi and Limousine Commission was able to begin to see where all the taxi cabs were, New York City, you won't notice as much here, but if you go north of 96th Street or you go out into the other boroughs, you will see a set of these apple green taxi cabs. They're New York City cabs. They charge the same prices. They're metered. They're regulated. And the reason they were able to win that fight was using GPS. They were able to demonstrate that the yellow taxi cabs, only 97% of them were either south of 96th Street or at the airport. And so it was easy to make the case that to get access for these other people, you could break the taxi monopoly a bit and issue all these new licenses for this whole other fleet of cabs that now give all these people huge access that they didn't have before. I think that's a very good example.
Yeah, well, I think we see the market in this rapidly changing with the entry of things like Lyft and Uber. We see in China, for example, I've gone to traffic operations centers in several Chinese cities, and it's routine that they use taxi cabs and buses and trucks as probes to monitor real-time traffic speeds 24/7, 365. Now, most of that is mobility measures. The key that I think is missing is how do we integrate that with effective understanding of where people live, where people work, and what people's met and unmet mobility and access needs are. And that's where I think the biggest challenge lies, particularly with informal settlements, which occupy a large part of the space of the built environment in so many cities. I don't know, Geetam, if you want to address that.
That's absolutely important. I was just going to raise this issue only, that these days, of course, we talk about smartphones and crowdsourcing, etc., to collect a lot of data. But then we are back to our traditional definitions. We start looking at minimizing times and improving speeds, and obviously speeds of pedestrians and bicyclists. So we are back to the old paradigm. But in fact, something very fundamental that Roger raised about poor quality of data and how do we start collecting more usable data. I think one of the experiences we've had is that, even professionals are trained and we have certain definitions in our mind. So we are collecting, we have a definition of trip and we go and do surveys. We are asking people to define their trip. But actually, when you start working with informal sector, which is a huge majority in all these emerging economies, we actually started understanding that when you ask people, okay, here you live and where is your place of work? For that person, the place of work is moving around throughout the day. What is your place of work then? So this whole understanding and theories, including survey instruments that we have developed, is based on our preconceived ideas. So we really have to question even our expertise at a very fundamental level. And we cannot, so the trip definition is different. For that person, it is not minimization of travel time. It is maximization of opportunities where the business can happen. So that's what, we started actually capturing, that based on this understanding, we need to have different definitions, we need to have different survey instruments, and then go back to technology interventions. Is it able to capture that or not?
Yeah. Well,
That's why in our experience, if I may say it's important to include the community in developing those approaches, because we miss things if we don't, if we come in from the outside and seek data. So that's always been an important part of our approach to it as well.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, a fun fact about New York is that everybody likes to talk about commuting into Manhattan, but the majority of New Yorkers live and work in the same borough. So I live in Brooklyn. I'm an exception in my neighborhood, apparently. Most people live and work, and I think that speaks to your point, is that the typical travel expert, even in New York, with technology, yada, yada, is obsessed about getting people into Manhattan. That's not always the problem. Maybe the problem is getting from one neighborhood in Brooklyn to the other, and that's something that we're now thinking more about, but we haven't historically,
Yeah. Well, right now, the United Nations is going through the process of trying to develop sustainable development goals, and spent the last 15 months or so in discussions of the open working group representing 80-some countries, and that group has submitted to the UN General Assembly 17 proposed sustainable development goals. The sustainable transport community internationally has worked to try and influence that process and has actually gotten transport into 7 of the 17 sustainable development goals that will be considered by the General Assembly for adoption next year, which will guide development assistance over the next 10 or 15 years. How we set targets and indicators to meet sustainable development goals may have a very important influence on how billions of dollars is expended in international development and sustainable development finance, climate finance over coming years. How can we better engage the question of access into that process so that the multilateral institutions are able to wrestle with it in a tractable way? How can we design a trajectory that says we still fall short on many of these quantitative indicators, but we can see a roadmap to how we'll get better measurable indicators over the next several years? Anyone care to reflect on that?
I have a question.
Okay.
I have nothing to do with what you said.
All right.
But the question is, what about the people who work in the transportation industries? Because we talked about the fact that we're concerned about giving people economic opportunities and access, and yet what happens in the cities we worked in Nairobi, or cities in Accra, or places I've worked in sub-Saharan Africa, you have a huge number of people who work in the transportation industries. You come to the United States, you have people who work in the taxi industry. Uber comes along, and says, we're going to just knock over their apple cart. And the question becomes, when you start to look at how do we deal with the people who actually supply a transportation service, most of whom are low-wage people, making ends meet, driving matatus in Nairobi or repairing matatus, or I would guess Roger could talk about the issues in South Africa. How do we address that issue? Because that's about economic advancement for groups of people. I realized when you mentioned Lyft and Uber, it made me think about this other question, that when you displace one group, when you privatize, you fire one group and bring in another group. That's my question.
Yeah, well, I think what we see in country after country, city after city, is that bus rapid transit, which is basically shifting from informal to formal, only succeeds where it creates effective structures to help with that transition, to enable at least a significant portion of the previous owners and operators of the smaller, less efficient buses and paratransit vehicles to find ways to join in new operating companies that can participate in the new, more formal, more efficient bus rapid transit system.
I think you could argue that too, that those new green cabs do that also. Mm-hmm. They formalize what was a more informal sector and works that way. But then the question becomes, when you get a technology like Uber, which is a great technology for a lot of reasons, including environmental reasons and so on, how do you incorporate that in a way that further enhances that rather than knocks over the apple cart? Mm-hmm. That would be one of the questions I would raise.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who's taken to using Uber, I've made it a habit of asking my drivers every time, how do you like this? How long have you been driving? Does this work for you? Are you making more money? And I have yet to find one of them who said that they don't find it to be a useful thing that gives them more control over their business, over their livelihood.
I'll send you to the website where they talk the truth, not what they say to customers. I will after.
Okay. Well,
so you probably get rated well by the Uber
yeah,
driver
for
asking those questions.
Right, that's the model.
No, because one of the debates that happens is they say I was one exchange where the drivers, there's certain neighborhoods I won't go into in LA. That's not my problem. Why should Whereas a licensed taxi cab has to go into those neighborhoods.
Right.
So I mean, there
But
are
there's some real issues.
edges on this that one has to deal with. But I'll send you to their website.
Yeah.
Michael, should I take a crack at your post-2015 question?
Please do, yes.
My other hat at the Rockefeller Foundation is that I lead our global health work. And in that context have been engaged in the post-2015 agenda, the health goal and the indicators there. One way in the health sector this question of access has been addressed is for civil society organizations and others to work very closely with a number of the international institutions that are going to be implementing or overseeing the implementation of the goals. So in the health context, the Rockefeller Foundation and others have been supporting work for the last couple of years on how do we measure progress? What are the indicators of that? How do we ensure that people really are getting access to the health care they need? And those are now developed in protocols with the World Health Organization, with the World Bank and others who are going to be putting the money on these questions in the future. So it just strikes me that in this sector as well, that may be an approach, is to come in with concrete ideas about how to measure accessibility and try to embed them in the protocols of the big international organizations.
Good, great. Well, I think I'd like to open this up now to interaction with all of you. And I wonder if, I don't know if we have a mic. Yeah, there we go. If you would like to make a question to any of the panelists or to our commentators and discussants, this would be the time to do that. And please keep your questions fairly brief. Yes.
I see a hand up. There's one up there.
Thanks. I've been with the Volvo Research and Educational Foundations as a board member for some 10 years. We started out, at least I started out thinking about it as vehicles moving. Then when you start thinking about as people are moving, then you have to start think in terms of social science rather than economics. And there is a saying which I remember from the late 70s about what energy is to physics, power is to social science. In other words, you can't understand physical science without understanding energy. And you can't understand social sciences without understanding power and power relations. And when Eliot talks about governance, it is really frozen power. Power going sometimes back decades. Power relations sometimes going back decades. When Gita talks about the relationship between pedestrians and cars on streets, it's really a question about the power of the middle class. And if you want to understand why BRT frequently has problems, it is because BRT corridors take street space away from the middle class, the car driving middle class. Now, how does an analysis of power structure and changes in power relations, how can that be incorporated into the analysis of urban transport? That is for all 4 of you.
Great question. Who wants to take it on?
I wish I had the answer.
No, but I do think what happens is the issue that Mons raises is it's the unstated issue all the time. You know, when we talk about using market mechanisms, using governance, using contracts, using Uber, using medallion taxis, we are talking about differential power. In other words, it means that somebody is in the foreground, somebody else is in the background. And I think that it's not that there is an answer. I think what it says is that in the method, in doing our analysis, we ought to be clear about whose ox is getting gored and who's doing okay. I think that's what I take from what was being said. Not that there was an answer, but that we're often not very upfront, or we're not owning that we really are talking about empowering some groups and disempowering others when we advocate a policy.
Yeah, I think, Mans, you're absolutely right. And right from the beginning, every time you come up with a detailed analysis, you reduce it to this, which is true. The question is that then where do we go from here? And that is a difficult question and at several levels, because it is, as I keep mentioning, for emerging economies, it happens to be minority, vocal minority. In that whole power structure, they are more powerful. And so in terms of discussion about sustainability, we talk about we want equity for all, accessibility for all. But eventually it is really serving the interest of minority. And it becomes the powerful minority versus the silent majority. In terms of any analysis, you would say, of course, we should benefit silent majority. But if it's a power struggle, is it because of our weak democratic institutions? Is it because of, power is also backed by financial power? It is, as I mentioned, I alluded in my initial remarks that it is also backed by very powerful international financial powers, very powerful technologists behind it. So what we end up calling a successful project and what we end up calling a failed project is also indicators are based on that. It is a BRT project. In fact, now in more and more cities that I see has become a construction project. Go and construct an exclusive bus lane where it is not needed. The buses could go fast even if you had not made an exclusive lane. But the whole point you end up saying is, yes, but in future we are actually reserving. And eventually it is just benefiting your construction lobby. So it is going back to that power structure. Eventually, I don't have any answers for that. Yes, it is about who has the power in this whole complex system. And I think if we are serious about sustainability, we will have to question this, and we will have to confront it.
I think I'll just say from a local government perspective within the U.S. That I think it's apt to call government frozen anything, because a lot of times nobody wants to change anything, because when you change something, it could be good, it could be bad, right? Especially if it's something new and you've never done it before. And so I think what it really comes down to a lot of times is also leadership. The silent majority in the U.S. In many cities is all driving. And so if you, thinking about it from sustainability again, like, okay, well, if we don't think that's sustainable to add 1 million cars to our current metropolitan area as policy wonks, then we have to think about it differently. And leaders, who are, I think John Orcutt said earlier, half of it, 50% is always leadership. And it's like, okay, well, how do you get your leaders excited about it? How do you get a leader that thinks that they can kind of win on this issue? In the US, for the last 50 years, I say the way to win is to build a new highway. And if that's always the answer, then you're going to get a lot of new highways, and that's what's been going on for 50 years until the money ran out. And so you got to kind of rethink that and provide a way to win for leaders, and then hope that the rest of the power structure can be modified through doing that, having the leader take that step.
I think one of the ways that we may be able to make some progress in this too is to take advantage of new and emerging technologies that give us the capacity to better measure and monitor the performance of the transportation system in real time, as we heard from a gentleman from Brookings. And by being able to do that, it gives us the capacity to start to treat surface transportation in more of the framework that we treat electricity, as a managed public utility in which we have certain goals. If we managed our electricity system the same way we manage our transportation systems, we'd have brownouts and blackouts on a daily basis, several times a day, which is what we witness on the road networks and when our transit networks fail to provide adequate services. But we are getting the tools, I think, to be able to better manage traffic in real time and to provide allocation of street space priority in real time, to price and manage mobility services in real time, that over the next 20 years, I think, could evolve into governance structures that enable us to focus more on performance and to hold government officials accountable for whether they're managing the governance of the mobility system in a way that delivers good service to customers, to travelers, to freight shippers, for a competitive economy that also delivers environmental performance and that's also equitable. And so technology could be our friend if we can bring it into this thing and break through the populist tendency to basically give it away for free and then not manage it.
Oh, Michael, you're such a dreamer. Let me
Go, yeah.
challenge when we talk about the electricity system, we're talking about these little electrons that are all the same. When we talk about the transportation system, we're talking about cars, we're talking about buses, we're talking about taxis that compete with buses, we're talking about metros, we're talking about parking lots, we're talking about freight rail, we're talking about freight trucks, we're talking about a range of different...
Pedestrians.
Yes. What? And I think this real co-location, but the thing is that when it gets to the issue that Mons raised, while I understand theoretically how one could think about something called the public interest and efficiency and want to maximize it with this, you're then up against the fact that any choice you make empowers one group and disempowers another. One of the problems we had in Kenya was to reconstruct the Mombasa to Nairobi railroad. It had a number of false starts for various reasons, but one of the reasons along the way was you had a lot of truckers that didn't think it was a good idea to do. So you're back to, so it's not that I disagree with you that there's this great potential in technology, but I also think you've got the power question that Mon's raised.
Anyone? Yes, in the back of the room. Okay, we have the mic here and then here.
Well, it's interesting because you have talked about vehicles, about technology, all of that, but what about behavior changes? Because basically, if we keep doing things in the way that we are doing, basically the possibility of making changes are going to be quite constrained. And basically, what about behavior changes on the part of the urban economies, the users, et cetera, et cetera?
Anyone?
What about behavior changes?
Behavior changes, and how can they affect?
What the role of behavior changes? I can take a quick stab at that. I say as professionals providing transportation facilities, we're also determining a little bit who wins and who loses, right? You were talking about that, Gitam, like, are you prioritizing pedestrians and now have to spend 5 minutes crossing this versus 2 minutes crossing that? Or are you prioritizing these cars that are now going to save, 10 seconds on average during their travel? We're picking winners and losers as designers of a system that people then interact with. Also on the property side, which we didn't really get into, but the housing, like where are people living, where are people able to go? And so we really have to keep that in mind and not expect people to act against their interests. And take, for example, I don't know, I was in someplace else, I can't remember, Indianapolis, and I said, I should really be taking transit because that's what I work on, And, you do the Google map and you click on the transit and it's like 1 hour and 20 minutes.
Right.
And then you click on the driver and it's like 15 minutes. And you're like, okay, I'm calling Uber, It's like, because I don't know the cab company. And so you can't expect people to just, like, out of the box, like, do something that's against their interests. For those of you who've been in New York for a while, you may notice there's more people cycling now. It's both because it's safer, but also because, frankly, it's faster. Almost any destination that you can accomplish in, say, 40 minutes by train, you can accomplish by 30 minutes by bike. Even more so, like a 20-minute train ride is now a 10-minute bike ride. And it's like, that's the real underlying reason. And so we should understand human behavior and human choices as we go through that. Time is a huge investment. Money sometimes also, if you have to buy a vehicle or if you have to buy a pass, if that's a significant cost, not in New York. So we were talking earlier, price of transit is very cheap, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I would like to endorse exactly what Linda is saying, that behavioral change comes from policies and how we implement those policies. The way we design our road, that decides, am I going to walk? Am I going to use transit, or am I going to bicycle? So behavior, I think design, policy, operations, all three actually is influencing human behavior.
Yeah. They tell you how
So
to travel.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We are making our decisions based on that only.
We found that, building on that, people need to visualize the change. They need to understand it, and at the street level. So in my community now, there's this convenience store on the corner, and there's a little shoe store across there. How would my access to that change with this change in transportation? So sometimes even simple tools such as a video that helps people visualize the particular change and how it would affect them helps, because people need to see it.
But you had to have a courageous transportation commissioner backed by her boss to institute that in the first place so that then people could realize it. So
The safety of bicycling and stuff.
Yeah. So once it's in place, it becomes obvious, but the question gets raised, how do you, because the thing that we're really all about too is theories of change. How do you institute, how does change happen? How does positive change happen? And what could one do? And in this case, there's a story behind what you know the story better than I.
Well, and I think, but part of this, which goes to this power dynamic, is if you can act quickly and get paint on the street and put a few chairs out there to create a public space where once it was car space, you can recapture the power dynamic by capturing the vision and the imagination of people in ways that changes behavior.
So they can see it.
So they can see it, they can feel it.
becomes
You know, in
tangible.
Stockholm,
Yeah.
when they implemented congestion charging, you know, the polls showed 30% support the day before it went into effect. It was very controversial, but within 2 weeks after, when they asked people, you know, do you support this? What significant majority supported congestion charging because they saw it worked. It delivered results, and then it won at the polling box. So I think this is where visualization does make a difference in allocating street space for access and overcoming some of these political challenges. But it requires leadership to be able to do that visualization. So I think, unfortunately, I think we're at the end of our time now. And so I'm sorry I don't have space for other questions. If you have questions for our panelists, please do them during the lunch break. And I want to thank all of our panelists and our discussants for a very lively conversation. Thank you.